Luckily for me, they found their way together here in Lawrence, Alabama, and as a result, I'm here. On my father's side, my grandfather was R.H. Walker, and he married Lizzie Lou Ray. The connection here is Dr. Ray's house is just down the road about half a mile. He was the resident doctor here in Oakland in the 1860s and 1880s, which, if you take an inventory of the number of pews in this area, you may guess that there may have been somebody here delivering babies by that name. As far as my grandfather, I really don't know. Robert may be able to, my cousin here, he may be able to help me more with that, but Grandpa Walker's famous saying was there's no law west of Cypress Creek, and for a good long while, my upbringing, I believe that's right. There really wasn't a whole lot here. What I'd like to touch on just a little bit with you first is kind of an overview of the history of this area, followed by kind of a eclectic or dyslexic, depending on which way you want to look at it, view of just random things in my growing up from Lasker Ditch, Cunningham to the Sinkhole. This area prior to the 1860s, well, first of all, I need to find the area I'm talking about for everybody. The Sinking Creek area roughly lays in this area, West Lauderdale County. Everybody see this? It's bordered roughly from the Savannah Highway to the Oakland Road, to this area of Smithsonian, north, really almost to central in places. The reason I'm describing it that way is the area that's drained by Sinking Creek, water from as far away as central ends up down on my place eventually. The western part of Lauderdale County and Colbert County prior to 1816 were owned by the Chickasaw Indians. In 1816 they sold their interest in that. There was already some settlement in this area. And by the 1820s, there was several farms already established. The Kearney Hands, Knowles, and different other people were already in the area. In 1822, most of the rest of the land, the West Lauderdale County, was deeded to white people. There was a small section left out called the Reserve, and that was finally incorporated in about 1822. Andrew Jackson's, one of his friends, General John Coffey, actually did some surveying in that area. As Miller said, to pick out some of the better land for themselves. Andrew Jackson did for a short time on Evans Springs, which I grew up knowing as the Blue Hole, which is just a little south of this church. Which incidentally, I grew up in this church. This was my home church, and there's several of you here who I really feel like I'll raise my hand and be talking right now. But it was at that time when Coffey surveyed the area, it was just pretty well a wilderness of trees and swamps. Although there was some prime farmland, he felt like it was better suited for meadows, which really to this day is more meadowland than it is anything. On my place right now, there's a tree that may have been there when General John Coffey surveyed. Recently we had it measured by the Forestry Service at 4.5 feet off the ground, which is right about here. It's about 29 feet around. Now, 29 feet, it's not very big, but if you think that the average span is, 6 feet? About 6 feet. It would take almost 6 of us to wrap around the tree. It's 127 feet high and has a spread of 300 feet. So if it was here on this property, it would cover everything. Trees been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's typical of the trees and the vegetation that were on the Sinking Creek at the early settlement. Sinking Creek's always been an agricultural area. In the 1820s and 1830s, these early plantations grew and prospered. Now these weren't the Forks of Cypress white column plantations. These were the planter plantations. These were the people who were there every day farming. They were not fancy, elaborate homes. Many times you might have a hard time telling the construction of the slave homes from the plantation house. They were log cabins, they were plank, they were just not what you think of as classical southern plantations. They were in their own way, though, very much that. If I could, this is from some of the historical publications that I don't think this one's available to buy anymore, but this is one of the earliest ones. It describes a camp meeting or a barbecue on the Cunningham place, which is where I live at. And it says a camp meeting was going on in the neighborhood amongst the colored people. An old man Cunningham, who was irreligious, didn't wish the slaves to go. He was a kind-hearted man and wished to see them enjoy themselves, and he gave them this barbecue, giving it to all who didn't go to the meeting. It was gotten up on a grand scale, and the feast of all fat things, sure enough. The negroes' cabins in rows through a beautiful grove where barrels of cider were stationed here and there, and the happy darkies given unlimited license to drink as much as they could. Free to all, the vast wooden trenches filled with barbecue pork were laid out in green grass with piles of bread and potatoes in the greatest profusion. That's a recollection, a letter from Charles Hines, as quoted in historical publications. This was the type of plantation you had. During the, up until the 1850s, then the 1860s was when the war began. This was the change. This was the beginning of a new type of era. As you know, there wasn't a whole lot of activity in this area, but a lot of people from the Bender River and Florence went to serve either the north or the south as their convictions led them. The biggest problem I think they had in this area were raids from people in Hardin and Wayne County, Tennessee, known as homegrown Yankees, who would sweep down through the area and pick up whatever they could and head back to Tennessee. There were some troop movements in the area, and even one famous skirmish, again from some of the historical publications. This refers to the Peters Plantation, which was located on Gunford Road about 5 miles from Florence. If you're ever out on Gunwall Ford Road, the Peters Cemetery is still there, and as far as I know, that's around the location of the home. The plantation was the scene of a skirmish between Federal and Confederate troops during the Civil War. The Federals were a company of the 9th Ohio Cavalry, known as the White Horse Company. They were on detail duty gathering beef cattle and had collected about 250 head and were camped on the Peters Plantation. Confederate Colonel James Jackson and Samuel Ives, with 100 men, crossed the Tennessee River on the night of April 12, 1864, a few miles below Florence. They surrounded the camp. 4 of the Federals were killed and 42 were captured. 2 escaped and fled to Florence and reported that General Forrest was on his way, and Florence thereupon was evacuated. There's various accounts of this in historical publications. I think that was probably the extent of the biggest battles in the Bend River. Canaan Church was, if you're familiar with that, it lays at the edge of the extent. It has some bullet holes in the pews from different little fights and battles. With the end of the Civil War, Bend the River, like the rest of the South, then began the John Crow Reconstruction era. The slave mentality shifted to tenant farmer mentality. And instead of slaves, you had sharecroppers. The storage-in landlord system controlled most of the capital, with the tenants supplying the labor. The result was that if you were a tenant farmer, if you're real lucky, at the end of the year, you didn't owe more than your store bill, which is another way of putting it, it was stolen from them.